Well, this is an update on a project that I'm working on, actually a couple projects. And I think this is the first video that we've done in about 3 months. But what I'm working on now is something called The Boys of Summer. And this is a series of my remembrances of growing up on the east side of Madison in the immediate post-World War II environment. What America was like then. And as I think about this, I'm writing copy that I'll probably use in the book form of it, but this is more of a promotional video and perhaps an attempt at crowdsourcing. But what I wanted to add to this is that when I looked at my copy and said immediate post-war America, I realized that large numbers of people do not know the difference between post-World War I and post-World War II, and I have to clarify that. And a film professor, who I wish I could disagree with, when talking about the award-winning film Dunkirk, contended that nobody knew who watched it, of the contemporary audience, that Dunkirk was actually about Dunkirk, and that Dunkirk was probably the most important battle fought in the Second World War, and had things been a little bit different now, we'd probably all be speaking German, and any of us that were of Jewish ancestry wouldn't be here now. One of my boys of summer grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and his father was a gunner during the Second World War on a B-17, which is a particular kind of bomber, which was used in the saturation bombing of Germany. Now, if I had an audience right now, I'm sure that their eyes would be glossing over and they'd be reaching for their cat pictures and their tablets and texting each other. So what I got to do is be more interesting than that. It used to be that when you were a writer, you had to be interesting enough to beat students out of their beer money so they could buy your science fiction. Now you have to beat them out of their cat pictures, which is kind of a hard job. But I'm going to go a little bit farther with that. There's a remote chance that some of you might be familiar with the movie Memphis Belle. And it was about a B-17 crew that survived 24 missions during the Second World War and the bombing of Germany. Well, the reason that was a big deal was that if you survived 24 missions, then you got to go home. But almost nobody ever did that because the attrition rate was so bad. So many of, if 1,000 bombers would fly over Germany, and there were raids like that, 70 or 80 of them would be shot down, which would mean 1,000 Americans were killed. Well, the reason I'm starting to pull, and I'm kind of doing a little tangential thing about the Boys of Summer, was it was our fathers that fought that war. And one of my friend's fathers, Richard West from Boston, completed something like 30 combat missions and got 2 Bronze Stars for doing so as a tail gunner on a B-17, and never talked about the war in his lifetime and to his son, and we only found out about it at his funeral. Now that's kind of cool, but there are some of these stories that have to come out. Now, a way of thinking about getting some of your attention about this guy who flew on the B-17, that got the 2 medals and through the 30 combat missions and maybe made it possible for us to live the way we did as winners rather than losers in the Second World War, was this. It turns out that in England, they don't chill their beer. And so Americans absolutely hated English beer. B-17s were not heated, they were not pressurized, they would fly at like 20,000 feet, and it was really cold. So cold that whatever extra space they had in the B-17, they'd fill up with English beer to keep it cold. So in one instance, Richard's father came back and the whole plane had been shot to hell. There were several casualties. I think a couple people got killed. And his fellow airmen said, "Yeah, but how was the beer? Did we save it?" The beer was saved. Well, there's a lot of stories like that. My friend Bob Akamatsu is a boy of summer, and he's reluctantly going to be part of the design aspect of this project. You have heard in every history course that you've ever taken, probably about the Second World War, about the incarceration of Japanese Americans in camps and the confiscation of most of their property. All this is absolutely true, and all this is warranted to be part of our history curriculum. But I want to tell you some more about my friend Bob. Bob and I went to Madison East High School together. We played football together. He was in ROTC for a while. He carried the flag in the little parade before the UW-Madison football games. And he went on then to work in VISTA, which was a kind of a domestic Peace Corps, and then ended up being kind of a contributing designer for General Motors Corporation. His family was beloved in Madison. His father worked for something called Piggly Wiggly grocery store, and he always went out of his way to give my mother very special service and my grandfather and make them feel like they were really an important customer. Well, Bob got a settlement from the United States government for the property he lost, but most important, he got a letter of apology from the United States government for the action that had been taking place during the Second World War when he was born in one of our a concentration camp. Doesn't quite explain it, but it was a pretty bad place. Now, the reason that I'm going into such detail about Bob Akamatsu is another friend of mine, Glenn Hovde, who I said I was going to mention his name, would come to the funeral of parents of the Boys of Summer as he went through his life. And not so many years ago, when Mr. Akamatsu died, Glenn came with his high school yearbook, found Bob Akamatsu had come back from his job or his retirement in Detroit, and they started having these breakfasts every six months. One was the day after Thanksgiving, and the other one was the day before Easter. And so I got talking with Glenn about this project, my Republican friend, and we started to get enthusiastic. And he added the component, Boys of Summer, Men of Black Friday. And what that allows me to do then is take the way that I remembered those people then, the way that we remember each other, and talk about what we're doing now, what we've contributed with our lives, and maybe even to do some of the healing that's so necessary now, as so much of America has been involved in a kind of a political retreat into the silos of the like-minded and the worst aspect of sectarian identity politics. I know those are a lot of really, really big words, but what I'm trying to say is that there is dialogues that need to take place in this country. There are opportunities, things that are changing that we can't dream of barely. It's hard to think of. In our school, for example, we had bullies, but there are ways of dealing with bullies. And the ways of dealing with bullies were not necessarily to involve the campus team on bullying or the school psychologist, but rather to rely on a big brother, make some friends, do something, interact in a way in which childhood experience didn't become colonized. Now, what did we do then? Well, the abiding image for me that gave me the thought of this Boys of Summer in the first place was in 1961, before football practice, a bunch of us went up to the Wisconsin Dells. And we sort of went to the rides, then we rented horses, we rode all around these areas and these orchards, and we ate a lot of fresh fruit, and we came home, and then football practice started. And everybody went to football practice, everybody participated. It was a kind of experience that forms the bond of a lifetime. So this is really a first step in a project report on a Boys of Summer, Men of Black Friday project. I'm going to be looking for some crowdsourced funding and trying to get some people interested in this. I think the idea of generational communication is really important. I have the privilege of working with a lot of millennials, and I find them great. I enjoy I consider it a privilege, and I'd like to pass back to them. For example, one of my associates asked me, well, what does a labor union do? Well, a labor union really allows you to, I would say there are instances where if you have union protection, that you don't have to put up with a boss being abusive. I spent most of my working life with union protection, and I was much better for it. There are other things people would argue about unions in terms of their bad examples. Certainly that's discussable, and I'm happy to do it. But it's interesting to say that, as I may have said this earlier in the video, that I called a Republican friend of mine and said that I agreed with Scott Walker on something in his State of the State address. And Scott Walker had said that Tommy Thompson was a pretty good Wisconsin governor. Well, Tommy Thompson was a progressive Republican, and his wife, through much of her career, was president of the teachers union. So let's just say that Thompson was able to make a deal. And politics is the idea of deal making, and maybe even making deals with people that you despise in order to get the job done.